Hey everyone, and welcome to Chef AJ Live. I'm your host, Chef AJ, and this is where I introduce you to amazing people like you who are doing great things in the world that I think you should know about. Well, my guest today is Dan Buettner, and he has a fabulous new book that just came out. It's called The Blue Zone's American Kitchen. You must check it out. There'll be a link below where you can buy it. And I'm going to talk to Dan about how he was able to write this book and how it can help you live to 100 and beyond. Please welcome Dan to the show. It's great to see you.
Thank you, Chef AJ. Always a pleasure to see you in your holiday finest.
Well, the first thing I have to say about this book is the photography is stunning.
Thank you. That's thanks to National Geographic photographer. I believe he's one of the best. His name is David McLean, and he's the same photographer that shot the original Blue Zones cover story with me, and we've been together for 20 years. Working on for National Geographic. So I managed to get him on this project.
That
took
is
20,000 frames, 20,000 frames to get the pictures in that book.
Oh, how does one choose?
It's a huge process. You know, it was about 3 years, and we work with a photo editor as well. And he starts out, you know, every day he takes, you know, maybe 1,000 images, and then he edits it down to maybe 50. So he's got a discipline of doing that every night. And then when the whole book is done, then he hands all that first edit over to an editor who distills it down. And then it's a back and forth, and they involve me. And it's a really big job. But, you know, the beautiful pictures in National Geographic represent literally thousands of hours of work. And that's the same case with the Blue Zone's American Kitchen.
Well, speaking of the Blue Zone's American Kitchen, one of the things you talk about in the book is how the standard American diet is killing over 680,000 Americans annually. That's almost 750,000. How can this help that not happen?
Yeah, so it's the processed foods, all the added sugar, the meat, cheese, and eggs. I'm convinced that that's what's killing the vast majority of people eating the standard American diet. The diet that I write about in the Blue Zone's American Kitchen, which, by the way, will be featured in National Geographic magazine later next year, is a diet that the longest lived people in the world have eaten. The same dietary pattern. And those people have about 1/5 the rate of heart disease. They have about 1/7 the rate of type 2 diabetes, 1/5 the rate of breast and prostate cancer and colon cancer, 1/5 the rate of dementia. So these are real people with an average set of genes who are eating the dietary pattern you see in the Blue Zone's American Kitchen for decades, and we're not seeing the chronic disease. So that's why I can make the argument that this is a diet that can wipe out most of that 680,000 unnecessary deaths.
You know, and when you talk about processed foods, even areas of the world that are not blue zones, but that have people that are much healthier than Americans, I think that's the common link. They just don't eat processed food.
That's right. And, it's very hard to beat it because processed foods and added sugars are so ubiquitous. They're the result of very cheap grains, our agricultural bill, and the food industry generates about 4,200 calories per person per year. They have these genius food scientists that know how to make them taste absolutely unavoidably delicious. They spend another $10 to $15 billion a year with the sharpest minds on Madison Avenue to sell them. There's about 25 times more fast food restaurants today than there was in 1970. Over 50% of all retail outlets, from where you get your tires changed to where you pick up your diabetes medicine, route us through a gauntlet of salty snacks and packaged sweets and sugar sweetened beverages. So here we are hardwired for fat, sugar, and salt, and we can't escape them. And our minds are constantly bombarded with, look how delicious this is, and it's so cheap. And you can't beat it unless you take a different approach.
Yeah. I understand that food is sold in stores that sell food and might not be the healthiest food, but why is there food sold, for example, at the craft stores, at the hardware stores, at the pet stores? Dogs don't eat M&Ms. This is what I don't understand.
Yeah. And the most fiendish is, I think, these Walgreens and CVS's that, they put their pharmacies in the back of the store, and they make you walk past the candy aisle or the boxes of soda to get to it. I just think that is just morally, ethically reprehensible. But it's money. I mean, I actually don't blame big corporations. Big corporations, food companies, it's not their job to make America healthy. It's their job, like every other company, to increase shareholder value. I mean, some of them have a nice conscience and they make an effort, but it's not their job. They're not the bad guys. It's our government's job. Our government's job is to create an environment where, as Thomas Jefferson said, to maximize the happiness and the health of the nation. And they're dropping the ball big time. But there's only so much we can do about that. The next environment that we almost completely control is our home environment. And my Blue Zones work, this book and the Blue Zone Challenge, and I have a whole suite of books, have really taken aim at not trying to clobber you over the head with yet another diet, but to show you how to shape your ecosystem so your micro choices throughout the day are just a little bit better all day long, especially during your meals, so that you can get all the good years out of your life.
Yeah. It's interesting. I never thought about that, but you're right. The pharmacy is always at the back. And so this way the people can pick up their candy and their soda before getting their diabetes medicine.
Just wrong.
It is absolutely crazy. You know how, like, where I live now, they're building a grammar school. And I remember I used to volunteer at grammar schools, and there are always big signs like no smoking within 500 feet, no drugs, no alcohol, no guns. Why can't there be the same sign with no processed food, like by a school or by a hospital, for example?
Well, with our Blue Zones projects, that's my daytime job. We hired by 71 cities, the insurance companies or the hospital system to lower the BMI. And one of the arrows in our quiver, actually, cities and schools have the power to change ordinances to, we call it a no-fly zone, 1,000 feet from any school. There's no junk food advertising, or these food trucks, which will pull up with their hamburgers and their hot dogs and their junk food and lure kids away from the school lunch. So no matter how good the school lunch is, if you have some competing junk food, kids are going to go out there. But municipal governments have way more power than they probably think. It's just someone, I think, to take them through the ordinances and the codes that can really improve the food environment. And that's really part of the answer.
Yeah. So how is the diet in the Blue Zones American Kitchen, the diet for longevity?
So I try to take my opinion out of it. Under the aegis of Harvard's Walter Willett a few years ago, we did a meta-analysis. And if you want to know what a 100-year-old ate to live to be 100, you have to know what she was eating when she was a child and a young adult, middle age, and newly retired. And to get at that, we found these surveys that were done in the population for 80 years, 155 of them, and we averaged them, and we found very clearly it was 90 to 95% whole food, plant-based, very high carb diet, but not your sugar and your white flour, but rather the complex carbohydrates, like mainly whole grains, corn, wheat, and rice, but the whole grain version, greens of every kind, tubers like sweet potatoes, peanuts or nuts, other kinds of nuts, and then beans. And beans were probably the cornerstone of every longevity diet in the world. We did see they ate meat, but it was limited to about 5 times per month. So a little more than once a week. So for the Blue Zone American Kitchen, I worked with a very clever researcher at NYU. His name is James Maitland. And together we spent about 150 hours in the archives. We looked through about 80 dietary surveys done since 1890 and anthropology studies, and we identified 4 American subcultures that were eating the exact same pattern that we identified in these longevity hotspots around the world. And this book is really organized around, once we found these subcultures, I then hired a producer who spent an entire year to find cooks and chefs who knew how to reproduce these heirloom recipes. So, by the way, these subcultures, even though they're living today, their food tradition dates back about 100 years. So I'm really bringing back a lost American diet of longevity. And to my great surprise, the food is maniacally delicious. It's not eating rabbit food. These people were poor, but they loved delicious food, and they were able to trial and error their recipes for many hundreds of years to arrive at these absolutely delicious recipes that use peasant food, which is essentially Blue Zone's food, but to make gorgeous and delicious dishes.
Well, speaking of gorgeous and delicious, I'm going to show some of the photos from the book, but I want to comment on something you said about a very high carb diet. I have Dr. McDougall on my show, which I've been doing almost 3 years now, for 2 hours every month, and people still are afraid to eat carbs, especially potatoes. And yet in one of the Blue Zones, Okinawa, that's pretty much what they eat.
Yeah, until 1980, almost about 2/3 of all their calories came from purple sweet potatoes. A little bit different than white potatoes, but nevertheless, we call it starch. But fewer than 2% of people there were ever obese. No discernible type 2 diabetes, and they produced the longest lived people in the world. 2/3 of their diet came from sweet potatoes. So that should be a significant data point for people when they're considering what to eat.
Those purple potatoes are the best potatoes in the world. You can't always get them in the United States. Sometimes you have to have them shipped in for Hawaii. But I mean, if you had to pick one food to live on, that could be it. They're so delicious.
AJ, I find them in Whole Foods all the time.
You find them in I think it depends where you live, but
okay, there they are right there. About. Yeah, aren't they delicious? By the way, that purple pigment contains the same antioxidants as blueberries, about 150% more antioxidant in purple sweet potatoes than you get in a cup of blueberries. So, it's superfood as far as I'm concerned. And by the way, I'll give you one of the easiest recipes, making it taste good. You take purple sweet potatoes, but you can take regular sweet potatoes, steam them or boil them, mash them up, add a can of coconut milk. I'll tell you what, it is one of the most delicious. It's rich. The coconut fat isn't necessarily the best of all fats, but it's not the worst either. But at the end of the day, meat eaters are used to their taste buds getting napalmed with fat and salt and just supercharged flavors. So the gateway drug to getting people away from meat to plant-based is fat. Putting some olive oil on it, coconut oil. Is it the best food in the world? No. Is it bad? I'd argue not, actually. But still, it makes these plant-based foods taste good, so you'll actually eat them. And at the end of the day, the most important recipe, the most important ingredient in any longevity recipe is taste. Because if you're not going to eat it for the long run, it's not going to do you any good on your longevity. You can't have the most healthy, delicious meal today and expect it to tack years on your life. What you need is to find those delicious plant-based meals that you're going to eat every week, or ideally every day. And that was the goal of the Blue Zone American Kitchen: foods that you would eat every day because they're cheap, easy, and fast, and like me. But they taste good.
Yeah, that's the main thing. If the food isn't available and people either don't prepare it or somehow get the healthy food, they're always going to default to the unhealthy, cheap choice.
That's right. And the convenient choice.
I'm curious if the the centenarians that you met, are their offspring as healthy? Are they going to be centenarians? Because I remember Dr. McDougall saying when he was a plantation doctor in Hawaii, he took care of 4 generations and each one was successively less healthy.
Good question. And the answer is the same thing's happening in blue zones. In fact, the Okinawan blue zone is already gone. I mean, we captured their formula or their blueprint, but they're now one of the most unhealthy prefectures in Japan because of the standard American diet just crashing on their shores in a big way. The other blue zones probably have generation. Now, one of the hopeful places, the island of Ikaria, Greece, there I met a lot of young people. I was just there a few months ago who, Ikaria is not known as a tourist destination for its, whitewashed villages or whatever. It's known now for, being one of the healthiest places in the world, and tourists are coming and they realize their great treasure is their traditional diet and the older people, and they're beginning to bring it back and preserve it in very optimistic ways. So, but no matter where the standard American diet or American food influences arrive, you can be pretty sure that obesity, diabetes, heart disease, dementia will soon follow.
Yeah, people want to live like Americans. They're going to die like Americans, fat and sick.
Heaven help them.
Yep. So I'm curious how you found the chefs and the cooks and the recipes for the book.
Well, first of all, I knew the ethnicities that I wanted. And by the way, they're African American, Asian Americans, Latin American, Native Americans, mostly living 100 years ago, or in the way they ate 100 years ago. My first call was to a New York Times writer friend of mine, Esquire editor as well, named Jeff Gordnier. And he'd been covering food for 7 years for the Times. And I said, this is who I'm looking for. So he immediately gave me about 15 chefs. And then we called those chefs, and they knew other chefs. And I had a very good producer named Karen Fauché, lived out in LA, and she spent a whole year working the phones to find these chefs who were not only representative of the ethnicity that we were focusing on, but they were trained cooks or chefs or had firsthand knowledge and skill at recreating these recipes from 100 years ago. And then David McLean and I, the photographer, during the pandemic, we got in Sprinter vans and traveled from Maine to Maui, from Minneapolis to Miami, found 55 of the chefs. And this book, the Blue Zone American Kitchen, isn't a bunch of recipes made in a test kitchen or in Dan's kitchen. We put this book together like a National Geographic article. It's all done editorially. Every recipe is shot in people's homes or backyards or these small restaurants. The recipes are original recipes that we captured from the chef or historical sources. And, I brought my 87-year-old father along. We actually found way more than 100 recipes, but my 87-year-old father, born on a farm in Minnesota, eating meat and potatoes, he came along with me, tasted every recipe, and if he gave it the thumb down, it didn't make it in the book, because I was pretty sure if Roger Buettner didn't like it, Middle America wouldn't like it either. So we really spent a lot of time making sure it's delicious.
That's hilarious. Has your dad ever been interviewed?
No, he'd be a great interview too.
I was going to say, I'd love to talk to him. Does he eat healthy like you?
Since for 10 years with my influence, he does. He's got an enormous garden. And, 87 years old, I realized he essentially lived the Blue Zone life the first 15 years. I mean, most of their food came from a garden. They preserved it with pickles, and they had a root cellar in their basement. And, meat, they did eat some meat, but it was very rare. And, they had one like pig for the family. They, butchered it at Christmas. But now he's a master gardener and become quite a chef. In fact, you'll see it at the back of the book. He actually contributed a recipe for us.
You're kidding. What's the name? Your dad contributed one? Which one?
Let me see. I got a book here.
I've
I'll
got to
go
look
through.
at that. In the
There's a
meantime,
picture of him in the front.
the pictures again, they're so beautiful. Wait, we got to find it because I did not know that. Oh, there it is. This must be your dad.
That's my dad.
Right.
And I will find his.
Yeah, tell us which is the recipe. In the meantime, there's a question from someone watching live and to ask you about something called the gulagichi. Do you know what that is?
Oh, just before we go on, here's my dad in the kitchen. It's on page 238, and his recipe is tomato, eggplant, and sweet potato pasta sauce.
Now that sounds delicious.
Vegan. Yeah, which is vegan. So the
the whole book is vegan, Dan, right?
The whole book is vegan. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like to. Roger Buettner and the word vegan probably never appeared in the same sentence in his 87 years. So it was just kind of fun saying that. But yeah, that's him, and he's a consummate Blue Zone father with family values and sense of purpose, and moves naturally, and now cooks plant-based.
Well, you know what? So, I think if you can, you should introduce us, and he should come on the show and make this recipe.
Oh, he would love that.
Show from the book. I think that will sell a lot of books to have your dad.
That's a big get. You'd be the first interview he ever granted. So probably national news on that one. But I'll make the connection.
Why not? I think it'd be amazing.
But the Gullah Geechee people, I will seriously. The Gullah Geechee. So this is interesting. They were West Africans, enslaved largely because of their ability to grow rice. They grew a type of African strain rice that today is called Carolina Gold. And I think it's the best white rice in the world. It's got the germ, so it's a little richer, it's nuttier, it's got kind of a vanilla aftertaste. And they were enslaved, brought over here to create these vast rice paddies off the coast of the Carolinas and Georgia. And because they could grow rice way better than their overlords, they were afforded some freedom to live near their paddies. They had their own houses in many cases, their own gardens, and they interacted with the Native Americans. And you created this very unique cuisine, which is fantastically delicious. By the way, Michelle Obama and Clarence Thomas are Gullah Geechee people, believe it or not, or have Gullah Geechee ancestors. Wow. It's a little known ancestry, but they're sort of congregated there on the coast, and there's some phenomenal chefs like Roosevelt Brownlee, who once cooked for the band Deep Purple, and B.J. Dennis. They're all in the book here. And most of the word gumbo, we think of gumbo as when we think of New Orleans, but gumbo is actually a West African word for okra. And these Gullah Geechees are masters at making one pot okras, which may have some beans in there, some greens, some other vegetables, but always these scorchingly hot brown bonnet peppers, an acid from vinegar, and then they have this ingenious source of umami, which is that that fifth flavor, that richness, which they get from sesame seeds. Or they call them Benny seeds, but they put those in there. And man, one pot, you let it stew for 20 minutes or so, and the result is a stew that will make you cry tears of joy. And the consummate Blue Zone food.
Nice. So Rachel wants to know, you mentioned that they eat meat maybe 5 times a week, and I'm guessing it's not a huge amount. She wants to know, do they eat fish once in a while as well?
Yeah, the Gullah Geechee, they're riverine people. So oysters showed up, it was mostly shellfish. All these cultures did eat some meat. The point is, meat was a condiment and celebratory food. If America could eat their level of meat, we wouldn't have a problem. Where you get in a problem, AJ, is when you start eating meat more than about once a week. As Harvard's Walter Willett famously said, we know that eating a lot of meat, it's like radiation. We know that eating a lot of it will kill you, but we don't really know the safe level. If blue zones is any indication, 5 times a month, probably okay. I personally, I'm not, I don't eat meat. I think it's a bad strategy for lots of reasons: environment, animals, and your health. And I've chosen all my books because the real innovation doesn't come in throwing a slab of dead animal in a pan and frying it up. The innovation comes in taking these cheap plant-based inputs and making them taste delicious. So my books are always 100% plant-based. But back to the answer, fewer than 5 times a month, I think you're okay.
And that's, I remember when my grandfather, who was born in 1902, that's what he said growing up. Meat was a very rare commodity. Maybe once a week they got it. And it was part of a bigger meal, like a little bit in a stew, right? And you think about it, meat is a condiment. Right. Most people don't eat animal products without condiments. I mean, you could maybe argue sushi, but even then it's got the rice with the sugar and the vinegar and all the vegetables and the seaweed. Plants are what make meat delicious.
That's right. And marinades and sauces. And I have a recipe in the book here. One of my favorite chefs is a guy named Rich Landau. He's got this phenomenal, should be Michelin starred restaurant in Philadelphia called Veg. And he showed me how to make a tofu steak that tastes just as good as any regular steak. And the secret is to freeze the tofu, slice a kind of generous portion, and then you rub it with what's called Montreal rub, which is it's got like salt and black pepper and red peppers and herbs and about 11 spices. You can Google it, or it's in my book. You rub it with that, and then you take an oil that has a very high smoking point, like grapeseed oil or avocado oil. Get it very hot, sear it on one side, just 1 minute, sear it on the other side 1 minute. The middle stays sort of nice and tender, but the outside is chewy like meat. It's got a very similar mouthfeel that a steak might have. It's got the same flavor a steak might have. And you put a knife and a fork to that, and boy, you're not missing out on a dead animal. You're enjoying a high protein source of food with healthy phytoestrogens and antioxidants and anti-inflammatory properties, and all the goodness and none of the toxins that you would get with meat.
And that sounds wonderful. Here's a question from Susanna. Does Dan know of any new potential blue zones or other pockets of longevity?
I do. And we have a series coming out on TV, on a streaming service. I can't say which one, but later this spring, a 6th and probably the last blue zone will be revealed.
Wow. I don't know if this is true, but when I've had Dr. Milton Mills on the show, he claims there's one in Huntsville, Alabama.
Yeah, there's not.
Okay.
I work with a worldwide team of experts. A lot of people there's a lot of false claims for a blue zone. And really, to confirm it, AJ, this isn't a flippant term that Dan Buettner shows up and names it a blue zone. We have a team of demographers that find birth records from about 100 years. We follow those births for an entire lifetime. We adjust for immigration and emigration, and we actually count to see how many people are still alive. And part of the problem with the American blue zone, there wasn't really good record keeping actually until about 1915. So it's hard to do. But also, Huntsville, Alabama, I'm afraid has been beleaguered by the same standard American diet that's killing the rest of us.
Wow. Do the blue zone people, do they know that they're a blue zone? Because doesn't an organism change the way it behaves when it knows it's being studied?
Yeah, that's called the Hawthorne effect.
Yeah.
I've only seen it in humans, but they weren't being studied. They were just being assessed. And so they didn't know they were being studied for the most part. This is epidemiology. They didn't know they were being studied for longevity. Let's put it that way. But now, to your point, that they are being celebrated for their longevity. Yes, you see in plant-based restaurants coming up, and you're seeing elders being celebrated, older people being celebrated. So there is a little bit of that self-fulfilling perpetuation, but nobody knew about these places until I started writing about them.
Nice. Janet says, did you look at European diets of immigrants who came to America and brought their Italian, Greek, Irish, Polish, etc., and traditional peasant foods?
We looked at all the available dietary surveys, and the problem with Europe, they tend to bring their cows and pigs and chickens and pickles over, and their diet was a little bit too animal product laden. Meanwhile, the Asians, they brought over their expertise with greens. They could identify 70 or 80 greens, and they're very good at making beans taste delicious. So there is a lot of wisdom in Italy. I'm part Italian, but it just didn't get translated. It showed up in America and manifested itself as pizzas, which, I like pizza as much as the next guy, but it's not exactly a longevity food.
Wow. Let's see. There's so many wonderful questions coming in. Oh, how can we help you? The question is how can we bring the Blue Zones project to our community?
Well, so let me tell you a little bit about the Blue Zone projects. The core observation is in Blue Zones, people they're not disciplined. They don't have a greater sense of individual responsibility. They're not better people. They don't have better genes. They live in environments where the food choices and the health choices are just better all day long because of their environment. So about 14 years ago, I brought that idea to America to manufacture a Blue Zone, but not by trying to convince everybody in the city to change their habits, but to change the defaults and the nudges in the city. So when our team comes in, we come in for 5 years, full-time people, and we work with city council to choose policies that favor healthy foods over junk food, to favor the pedestrian over the motorist, to favor the non-smoker over the smoker. We certify restaurants, grocery stores, workplaces, schools, and churches that change their policies and designs to favor healthier food, natural movement, social connection, and living on purpose. And there's a number of them, by the way. They have to follow through. We can usually get somewhere between 30 and 50% of all those places certified in a 5-year period. And then we get 15% of the population to become a Blue Zone ambassador. And the only way it works is when the public sector agrees to it. So the mayor, the city council, the chamber of commerce, the big CEO, the superintendent of schools, they all have to understand the Blue Zone project and say they support it. So we do that as pre-work. But then ultimately we have to get the funding, and that usually comes from the Blue Cross Blue Shield plan or the hospital system or a local foundation. So, for us to come to your city, we have to have a pretty clear line of sight to both public sector support and then a source of funding. And, sadly, we spend $4.2 trillion a year on healthcare. 85% of that is on cleaning up the mess, trying to get sick people less sick. If we could just take, one of those little trillions, not even that, $1 billion, and spend it on making our living environments healthy, we would save probably hundreds of thousands of lives every year.
Yeah. Well, Morgan is saying you have a fantasy job working with National Geographic and traveling and studying other cultures. That really is a dream job, isn't it?
It really is. I'm very lucky.
Yeah. Is that what you wanted to be when you grew up?
I wanted to be a fireman.
It's not too late.
By the time I was about 20, though, working for National Geographic was my dream job. And I'm still doing it. I have an article in January's issue of the magazine, and the Blue Zone American Kitchen is actually a National Geographic publication.
That's amazing. Well, I can't wait for that article to come out. Let's see. Here's a question from Gina. Is the okra recipe you mentioned in the book? I know that when I looked it up, there was at least 3 okra recipes.
Yeah, there's a bunch. In the African American, okra is really important in their diet. So delicious.
Yeah.
We don't really understand it in the north, but it's amazing.
You know what? I think some people don't like it because it can have a slimy texture, but I find if you grill it or air fry it, it doesn't do that.
Yeah, and if you cook it in stews, it becomes a thickener. You
Yeah.
don't see the gooiness. It makes a soup a stew, and a deliciously hearty version of a more, I would say, liquid
And I
food.
actually learned from one of the GI doctors that I interviewed on the show that it's the sliminess that actually is good for our gut microbiome, that there's something almost magical in the okra slime, if you will.
I did not even realize that.
Yeah.
That's
I'll
good
see
to
if
know.
I'll see if I can look that up. I'm guessing though, in addition to their eating healthily, bad habits in the blue zones, I'm guessing they probably don't smoke or drink alcohol to excess.
Well, we have some data on that. I mean, actually, for example, in the Icarian blue zones, we followed up on 90-year-olds, and about 75% of them smoked when they were young, and now it's down to about 10%, and about 8% rather. And I mean, that's proof that if you're smoking now, you're not doomed. You can quit and live a full, wonderful life, but you do need to quit.
Yeah. Do any of the blue zones have any hesitation eating white potatoes?
No, well, so you see lots of potatoes in Icaria. They've been there since the 16th century. In Sardinia, potatoes are used to make gnocchi. The Seventh-day Adventists in California eat potatoes all the time. Where I think what gives potatoes a bad name are potato chips and French fries, which are definitely not healthy. But a whole potato, especially if you keep the skin on, no, it's a very good food. And if you look at potatoes in isolation, it can spike our sugar. But when you eat potatoes as part of your meal, maybe there's some sauce on the potato, maybe there's some protein in there, other high fiber vegetables next to it. That ends up as a mixture in your stomach, and it doesn't, when it's mixed with other food, it doesn't have the same insulin spiking qualities, and you're getting all these vitamins and micronutrients, and you get fiber, especially from the skin.
Thank you. Susanna wants to know, and I was going to ask you this also, what is your personal favorite recipe from the book?
My favorite is that okra stew. BJ Dennis's okra stew. That's one of my favorite. The other one is that there's a garlic tofu. I met this woman named Ruth Chang, 96 years old. She's in the book. She's wearing this beautiful green. See if I can find it here quickly. A beautiful green dress, and Chinese Americans living in Hawaii, the women are the longest lived demographic in the world. Their life expectancy is about over 90, which makes them the longest lived. And here's Ruth right here. It's on page, you can see it better than me, on page 142. But this is, I got this weird thing going on here.
Wait, because you got a virtual screen. Let me get it for you. Oh yeah, here she is.
Yeah.
She's serving you food.
Yeah, she's 95, and she's got this wonderful garlic tofu she made for us that was just rich and satisfying and delicious. And that's another one of my favorites. Mushroom medley soup.
I think this is my favorite photo in the book. I have, this is just beautiful.
And that's not that hard to make. There it is. Segue. Yeah, grain salad with mango and avocado. This same chef makes this a soup. It's kind of a sad story, but to fatten up the slaves to make the journey from Senegal to America, they had to weigh 150 pounds, and the slave owners would fatten them up with a slurry of black-eyed peas and palm oil. And this chef took that same base recipe. He used artesian palm oil, the finest organic black-eyed peas, wonderful herbs and spices, sweet potatoes, edible flowers, and he makes this gorgeous soup. Then he serves to rich white people for, as part of an $80 meal. But he was kind enough to share that recipe, which, there's a little protest in that recipe. There's a little bit of, reminding us of our history that isn't so flattering, and sort of feeding it back to us in a nice way, but, in a remindful way.
I actually Googled the slime in okra, and just so you know, it says it's rich in soluble fiber, known for its potential to lower blood cholesterol and be fermented in the gut, which supports the growth of healthy bacteria.
There we go.
So maybe make people want to eat it. I'm curious, Dan, in all the years of traveling to blue zones and other locations, did you notice a lot of overweight people or any overweight people in the blue zone? And where did you notice the most overweight people in your travels?
Well, I know the statistics. Before the year 2000, fewer than 2% of people were obese in the blue zones. The only possible, now they're all kind of getting fatter. Okinawa has a real obesity problem because, the American base and all the fast food restaurants that came with it. Seventh-day Adventists, they're plant-based, but they eat a lot of processed plant-based food. And that can be just as bad for you as non animal processed food, at least health wise. So I think processed food is really the thing that's making us blow up, quite literally.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's a question: when you have encountered older people eating junk food, how do you do you have a response to that? Does it shock you?
You know what, AJ? You don't see it that much. And here's why. Older people, their dietary habits have been solidified. And they like the foods of their childhood. They're mindful. I really don't see many older 80, 90, 100-year-old people eating any junk food. In many cases, soda pops are unknown to them. They may have eaten a hamburger once, but didn't like it. The only probable exception was Spam, which the GIs brought to Okinawa in 1945, and they developed a bit of a taste for Spam, which was used in stir fries. But they're in it once again only sparingly as a kind of a condiment. But
I'm curious. Susanna wanted to know if some of the people that you got to know and interviewed, some of the centenarians, have they started to pass away? Yes,
almost all of them have. Life expectancy for centenarians 14 months. So they sad. I mean, that said, there are several are still around. Panchito, buddy of mine in Costa Rica. I met him at 100 and now he's 103, still riding his horse and chasing women, as far as I know.
This is such an interesting picture. What are you guys doing?
He's showing me nettle, which is an edible part of the plant. Yeah, Matthew Rayford. He cooked in the White House, and he said, I'm tired of the rat race, and he bought his grandmother's farm, and now he's growing organic. He's become vegan. Amazing guy.
Yeah, I'd love to meet him. He sounds fantastic. So a couple of the
Really
viewers
nice.
asked if the recipes had oil, and I said some of them did, some of them don't, and it's generally minimal oil. But Janet said, would it be possible and would it be easy to make the recipes oil-free? I don't see why not.
I don't see why not.
They're not fried.
These aren't these recipes don't come from Dan Buettner's kitchen or Test Kitchen. They are made the way people ate them. You're free. We tested all these recipes, and like I said, my dad tasted every one of them, and he had to give it the thumbs up. But I think in most cases, especially if you're not eating oil right now, if you took most of the oil out, it's probably going to taste delicious to you. Again, I made this book is for the average American, and the food has to compete with the taste of meat, cheese, and eggs, or I'm not going to get people. So
Yep.
the easiest way to do that is with it's usually olive oil, which I believe is a healthy oil. In fact, I'll tell you something about oil. I know there's a lot of sort of non-oil people, and especially if you're suffering from serious heart disease, oil is not a good idea. But for older people over 65 in Ikaria, we did a follow-up study with the University of Athens, and we found actually what predict the lowest mortality was oil consumption. In other words, the older people who ate the most olive oil had the lowest chance of dying in any given year. That was olive oil. And of course, it's very high quality olive oil. So I think the jury is out on oil.
Right. Well, the thing is, in terms of caloric density, it might be something that people want to eliminate or reduce. But like I opened this book just randomly to this recipe, Syrian brine beets and cauliflower. There's no oil in this one, for example.
Yeah.
And that looks delicious.
But I'm not an oil advocate. If you can get the flavor without the oil, I'm all for it.
Yeah. Absolutely. So here's a great question from Gina. I don't know if you're allowed to answer, but she said, what recipes did your dad not love and give the thumbs down to?
Oh, yeah. Well, recipes with a bitter melon. He couldn't stand that stuff, which is, it's an Asian, it looks like a warty cucumber, super healthy for you. He didn't like stuff. He didn't like a lot of the tofu recipes. What else? He didn't like the seaweed recipes. Once you start getting too exotic, we lost Raj.
That's so funny. Yeah. All right. Let's see. Who was the oldest living person ever in the world? Do you happen to know?
Right now, it's probably a Japanese. It's usually a Japanese or Mediterranean person. But it changes every 3 or 4 months. Because somebody who's over 110 has about a 6-month life expectancy. So that's why you always see the oldest person dies. Well, we get 4 oldest person dying every year.
That's true. Yeah. Somebody's asking, is anyone doing this type of research in Canada?
There is a demographer named Robine, Robine, great demographer. He might be doing some. And we actually thought we found a blue zone in Canada among the Acadians living in Newfoundland. And there are 3 sort of interesting longevity hotspots, but they just weren't as extraordinary as the Adventist, and so we didn't include them, but I would call them a blue zone light.
Yeah. Are we allowed to talk about something? I heard it on the Rich Roll podcast, so I'm guessing it's okay to talk about. But you have a food line coming out.
Yes, it's I'm teamed up with some Matthew O'Hare, who started Vital Farms. And he's a vegetarian himself, but hugely successful. Started with 50 chickens about 8 years ago, and now he's got a $1 billion company. And we're creating Blue Zones foods, and the idea is foods inspired by the longest lived people with a maniacal focus on deliciousness. And the idea is going to be whole plant-based food. And I now have 200 recipes from the Blue Zone American Kitchen and the Blue Zone Kitchen for inspiration. And it'll be frozen. You'll see them first in your grocery store. And secondly, you'll see your doctor one day prescribing you Blue Zone's food when you come out of the hospital as your first line of pharmaceuticals to help reverse diabetes, heart disease, and other chronic diseases.
That sounds amazing. Can you tell us what some of the offerings will be? When will it be available, and where will it be available?
Yeah, the first they'll start being available at the end of next year, Q3 of next year. Probably some of the first ones will be, I found the minestrone of the longest lived people in the world. That recipe will be in there. There'll be a chunky miso. There'll be a black bean squash and a rice dish from Nicoya, Costa Rica. There'll be a longevity stew from Icaria. So those will be some 4 of them. But there'll be, mostly a lot of beans, but beans made to taste like meat.
That sounds amazing. We don't talk about this a lot, but it's in your bio. You hold 3 Guinness World Records in distance cycling. Are you still cycling?
I cycle. Yes, I am. I mean, I intentionally live in places where I can get around on my bicycle. The ideal number of bicycles to own, AJ?
3. How many?
It's N+1, with N being the current number of bikes you own. And I kind of subscribe to that. So I have about 10 bikes, various places around the country. But I hold the world record for biking from Alaska to Argentina, for biking around the world, and for biking the length and width of Africa. And I did that as a young man.
Man,
I'd do it again if I had the time.
You really have had an incredible life. You should just write a story on your life.
Yeah, I'm still living it. I'll wait till I can't live it anymore.
I know, but still, really, really, wow. I feel like Clarence the Angel said to George Bailey, and It's a Wonderful Life. You really have had a wonderful life. I mean, and still,
I really have.
Yeah,
I recognize it. I'm very blessed. I'm very blessed. I'm thankful to my parents for that.
Really exciting. Well, I hope I get to meet your dad. So Karen says, what kind of lifespan are they now seeing in the Adventist community? Because are they turning to junk food as well? Because what I noticed many, many years ago, because I've been vegan for over 45 years. And when I became vegan in 1977, there was no vegan junk food because there wasn't even, soy milk or there was nothing other than the kind of foods they ate in the blue zones. But I do know that when I used to go to Adventist churches or bookstores, they had these like canned meat, like made by Worthington, that didn't seem very healthy. And so I'm curious how the Adventist community is faring. Are they still going to stay a blue zone, you think?
And that's a good question. And I don't have recent data. But if I had to guess, their health will deteriorate as more, you go into the Loma Linda co-op, which is a grocery. It's actually phenomenal. I don't mean to badmouth it at all, because it's 10 times healthier than any other grocery store in Loma Linda, California. It's actually worth kind of a field trip if you ask me. But yeah, there's a lot of processed foods. I went to the Natural Food Expo, which is mostly plant-based, and I'd say 90% of the food is processed. So there's this big wave of eating more plant-based, but unfortunately it's processed plant-based, which is not doing people much of a favor when it comes to their health. Now, on issues in the environment and issues of animal cruelty, yes, these foods need to be applauded. But on issues of health, I'm not at all a fan of any ultra-processed foods, and you should eat these foods in their original state and get a good recipe. It'll taste just as good. It'll be cheaper. You can batch them and make it ahead of time. So get some of Chef AJ's recipes and you're good to go.
Or these recipes. I want
Thank you very much.
The whole I want to find the page again, but the whole roasted cauliflower looked delicious. Susanna wanted to know the elderly children of the original centenarians. How are they doing? Are any of them eating the same way as their parents?
Yes, they all do. When they go home to eat, the difference between Blue Zone's families and our families is they stick together. Grandma typically lives in the home and she's still doing the cooking. So the kids are still doing that. Unfortunately, when the kids go out of the home and eat, you're seeing more chips and sodas and hamburgers and pizzas and all the other crap that's killing us popping up in the Blue Zones. But when they go home to eat, they're mostly eating Blue Zones foods.
Nice. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. John Scharfenberg. He's an Adventist doctor who was actually the instructor of Dr. Hans Diehl, another prominent Adventist doctor.
Oh, yeah. He's
turning 90 on December 15th, and 99. and he's going to be on the show. And the funny thing is, he's already sent out the invitations for his 100th birthday, which is not.
Oh my God!
Next
See,
year.
living proof that this works.
Yeah, absolutely. Ruthie would like to know if there are many recipes in the book that are gluten-free, or if not, are they gluten-free adaptable?
Yeah, there's a ton of gluten-free. I would say most of them are gluten-free, actually.
Yeah, I can check that, but I don't remember seeing a lot of gluten in it. And if something called for a flour, you could always use a gluten-free flour.
Yeah. There's one seitan recipe in there, but it's mostly all gluten-free.
Yeah, I believe it is too. Okay, so, salt. Melissa says, is there any salt and longevity? Do those have anything to do with each other? And will your meals be low salt?
I don't know if they're low salt. I didn't measure them against sort of salt. They're certainly not high salt. I would venture to guess they're much lower sodium. Certainly the soups probably have a half the amount of sodium you see in a canned soup. There's not a lot of fried food in there. I would say it's low sodium. I haven't really looked at the recipes through that lens, but I'm sure it's low sodium.
Do you notice, like, in the blue zones that people tend to not overeat? Like, Americans always seem to be putting food in their mouth. Like, you go to a soccer game, you go to a meeting, in other countries, you can't eat at your desk at work, you can't eat at your desk in school. But I was shocked when I went to college, which was a long time ago, that like we could just like bring pizza in, like, and Coke. They didn't care. So do you find that they're not constantly eating all day long?
That's right. So part of the secret is what they eat. The other part is how they eat. And, they tend to get all their calories in an 8-hour window. They front load their calories at the beginning of the day. So they're probably eating 75% or 80% of all their calories by about 1 in the afternoon. They do eat a big breakfast. They eat with family. They don't typically snack. And because their food is calorically not dense, I don't know what the opposite of dense is.
Dilute. It's calorically dilute.
Thank you. Calorically dilute. You go to Okinawa and their goya champuru, which is a stir fry of root vegetables and tofu and wonderful herbs, and that looks like digging into a compost pile, and it's delicious, but it has fewer calories than a hamburger. So, maybe we can take one more question.
Sure. All right. Well, if you have time really quickly for two, and yes, Janet just wants to know, how and when will the government support healthy eating?
When we change lobbying laws, I think that would be the first, because right now these big food companies and the meat industry have undue influence on the egg bill. The egg bill is deeply flawed. But the other part of it is when Americans start eating whole food, plant-based, and the demand for whole foods goes up, the market will respond. And so it's there's two variables in the equation.
Okay. Last question real quick. What does Dan Buettner eat in a day?
Dan Buettner starts his day about 10 a.m. with Sardinian minestrone with 3 beans and all kinds of vegetables and a little barley in there. So I get my day started. I have a mid-afternoon smoothie, which is almost always blueberries. And I put spinach in there as well, some flax seeds. And then at night I go out. I'm one of these, I have a pretty packed social schedule. So I'm out to dinner every night, which is the one thing I wish I could change, but I just love my life too much. So, and when I go out, I don't eat meat. Plant-based and whatever I find on the menu.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Dan. Your book is already #1 in new release and vegan cooking. I wish you every success, and I do hope to meet Roger someday.
When we hang up, I will make the connection. I think the Blue Zone American Kitchen makes a great gift for Christmas. It's got beautiful pictures for the coffee table or recipes for your kitchen shelf. It's a gift of life. It's on Amazon. And if anybody wants, if you didn't get your question asked, if you direct message me at Dan Buettner on Instagram, I answer them all myself. And I want to thank you, AJ. You're a powerful force for health in America. You're a important member of our plant-based community, and I salute you and thank you. And I thank the people listening right now. There's a lot of things you could have been doing for the last hour, and you spent it with us. And I wish you a happy holiday, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And this is the first recipe I want to try right here. It looks
Ah,
amazing.
there it is,
You're
right
right.
there.
This will make a great holiday gift. Thank you so much, Dan, for your work. Take care.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And thanks all of you for watching another episode of Chef AJ Live. Please come back at 11 when my guest is Rachel Eccles. She has a nearly 100-pound weight loss story she'd like to share with you, living in an unsupportive